morning, everybody, or afternoon, depending on where you are. For those who I haven't had a chance to meet before, my name is Gary Painter, and I am the director of the Sol Price Center for Social Innovation. A special welcome to everyone for joining us here today. Today, we're going to be looking at two other important aspects of social innovation, social movements, and social enterprise. And Christine, if you could move back to the previous slide. So for us at the USC Price Center for Social Innovation, Christine Beckman, Giovanna Rosen, and I, and others with input kind of wanted to at least share our conception of social innovation, what drives us intellectually and thinking about outcomes. And this is how we define social innovation, which is an iterative, inclusive process which uses specific innovation frameworks to achieve more effective and just solutions to solve complex social problems. And so you can see that there are processes happening. You can see how social movements fit within these frameworks because of the processes and modalities of social movements. You can see how social enterprise and social entrepreneurship, where you see specific leadership, can fit within this framework with the goal, again, to solve complex social problems. And so with that, today, let me just go over some logistics. We will be having a chat function, and in the chat function, you can put questions for the presenters, and those of us who are going to be managing the chat function will do our best to make sure that we're able to capture those questions when it comes to Q&A at the end. But we also want the chat function to be a place for free-for-all discussion so that as you're having thoughts, please share with everyone who's in the room. And I found this to be kind of a fun way to be engaged on an ongoing basis, even if you certainly can't interrupt the presenters in those moments. In the discussion portion, I would, again, while there will be some questions in the chat box that I can bring forward, I also would ask if you could use the raise your hand function, which is in the participant panel of the Zoom box. That way we can kind of call on you if you want to uplift the chat question that you had asked before, or you have something in that moment. So we're going to, of course, ask everyone to be muted, and you can check that in the standard way. And then once you are asking a question, please unmute yourself. So the format will be 15 minutes per paper, 10 minutes for each discussant, or per discussant per panel. And then there's 10 minutes for open Q&A. And so with that, I'd like to invite the first panel, which is easy to invite over Zoom to kind of come up to the podium, so to speak. And it's going to be on social movements. Mary Hunter McDowell is going to be presenting her work on profiting from protest, a contingency model of the disruptive capacity of anti-corporate activism. So with that, Mary, let me turn it over to you, and we'll get started today.
So hi, I'm May McDonnell from the Wharton School, and I'm going to present this working paper with one of my wonderful third-year doctoral students, Samantha Darnell. Samantha is a particularly impressive and active researcher. So she hasn't sent any papers out into the research world just yet. But remember this name, because very soon you'll see a veritable flood of really impressive papers from Samantha. So I feel obliged to let you all know about her early on. So I think that this topic fits really well with the interests of this group because, of course, social movements are a key driver of corporate social innovation. What is one of the fundamental questions driving social movement research traditionally is, why do movements ever work? Because activists are typically marginalized stakeholders on the fringes of institutional field, and they rarely have any kind of formal power or voice to affect organizations. So why do firms ever do what they say? At this point, I think that the literature has broadly coalesced around an answer to that question, and it is that activists succeed through disruption, principally. So they rely on contentious tactics that problematize the firm's behaviors in the media, so things like boycotts and protests and corporate campaigns. And through these tactics, they threaten to reduce the loyalty and support of a firm's core stakeholders, the stakeholders who they do listen to. And so this is how movements get firms' attention and can win a positive response from their targets. And a body of work shows this in a number of different stakeholder contexts. So social movements can alter consumer preferences. They can turn consumers toward competing products like organics in the food industry, for example. They can affect market participants' behavior by increasing shareholder divestment. They can affect non-market stakeholders' behaviors by increasing regulatory scrutiny and reducing a firm's access to its core political constituencies. So we have a broad amount of evidence that shows that social movements do in fact disrupt their targets on average. That said, a puzzle that many of you have probably grappled with in recent years is that it seems like, especially recently, there are a number of firms that appear to profit from protest. So after Nike's Colin Kaepernick ad, for example, there was a huge boycott against Nike, but they said that boycott actually sparked consumer appetite for the products, and Nike earned $6 billion from the boycott. A similar story is Chick-fil-A after their then president took a public stance against LGBTQ marriage. The company's sales skyrocketed, so its sales more than doubled in the year after that boycott occurred. So that provokes the research question of our paper: what determines when social activist challenges strengthen or weaken stakeholder support? And our broad proposition is that the effects of a social activist challenge on a target are going to be contingent on the extent of ideological alignment or political alignment between the activists and the targeted firm's core stakeholders. So let me walk you through the basics of the argument, and then I'll jump into a few examples to give color to it. So we know, of course, that stakeholders are drawn to firms that share their values. So people are looking for values fit alignment when they're seeking out firms to support and commit themselves to. Pro-social cues increase stakeholder identification and support. Anti-social cues provoke stakeholder opposition and disruption. And we have a really huge, impressive body of research across OB and macro OT that shows this at this point. So where activists fit into this equation is they problematize a firm's efforts to cultivate its impression of corporate social responsibility. And so what they're trying to do is tell the stakeholders who are drawn to that firm that the firm is not sincere, or that the firm, its social behavior is problematic in some way. So they should question their loyalty. However, the kinds of issues that social movements typically grapple with are politically contested issues. So they're not issues that typically have a clean and unanimous agreement in the public about what the right thing to do really is. So corporate social responsibility is socially contested in that way. A great example of this is that there's oftentimes examples of social movements that are advocating for completely opposite positions. And the movement actors will be saying that their position is the morally correct one, even if it's the opposite of another movement. So Disney was boycotted by conservative activists in 1995 for extending health insurance benefits to the partners of gay employees, for example. And United Airlines was targeted by liberal activists in 1997 for failing to offer those same benefits. So we see social movements mustering on either side of the political spectrum. What that means for our purposes, importantly, is that a social activist challenge as a cue of a company's social values could be perceived as normatively appropriate, pro-social, or objectionable, anti-social, depending on the ideological orientation of the stakeholder who's perceiving it. So if a company has conservative stakeholders, then they're going to interpret a social movement very differently than if it has liberal stakeholders. So that leads us to the proposition at the heart of this paper that whether an activist challenge provokes disruption or support is going to depend on whether the challenge is ideologically aligned or misaligned with the target's core stakeholders. I just want to walk through two really quick examples at either side of the spectrum. So the first side of the spectrum is when a firm's stakeholders are aligned with a challenging movement, the activist claims are operating to undermine their support and disrupt the firm's performance. And a great recent example of this is the boycott against Wayfair last year in June, when it was revealed that Wayfair had been supplying beds to a detention camp migrant children put up by the Trump administration. And so Wayfair has an extremely liberal employee body, and it's in an extremely liberal state. So Wayfair is headquartered in Boston. 99% of the 868 political contributions from its employees in the last 2 election cycles went to liberal candidates. This is an extremely liberal employee-based, and the boycott itself was extremely disruptive. So over 10% of employees at Wayfair walked out of the organization into Copley Square in Boston and had a huge protest, and this drew a lot of media attention. On the other side of the spectrum, when a firm's stakeholders are ideologically misaligned with a challenging movement, then we're claiming that the activist claims actually strengthen stakeholder support by signaling that the firm is in fact aligned with stakeholders, and stakeholders are going to rally to the firm because it's being attacked for values that they believe in. So as an example of this, back to that Chick-fil-A example, in 2012, it was protested because of its president's stance against gay marriage. Conservative lawmakers rallied to the organization's defense. They instituted a formal Chick-fil-A Appreciation Day. Customers created boycotts throughout the Deep South where they would pledge to only eat Chick-fil-A every day until the end of the boycott. And ultimately, this played to Chick-fil-A's advantage. So its sales soared 12% by the year's end. And Chick-fil-A is a firm that is located principally in more conservative states. And so it's headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. Most of its traditional footprint has been in the Deep South, which has this traditional family values orientation. And so its stakeholders are more conservative. And this liberal movement against it helped its performance. So putting these two things together, our overall hypothesis is that as the ideological alignment between challenging activists and its target's core stakeholders increases, the challenge will lead to more adverse performance effects and a higher likelihood of concession. So it'll be more disruptive. We test this using a large sample of consumer boycotts, all boycotts against publicly traded companies from 1990 to 2018 that received major media attention. We have an N of 405 boycotts. We had a team of former lobbyists code the ideology of these on a scale of -1 to 1. So they were -1 if they were aligned with a conservative political agenda, a 0 if the issue didn't map on to a political agenda, and 1 if the issue mapped onto a liberal agenda. And just a really interesting descriptive note here, I've put these graphs, is that we see a really interesting trend in the ideological makeup of social activism over time that I think is worthy of a lot of future exploration. So if you see on the left here, this is the total progressive boycotts by election cycle. And on the right is the total conservative boycotts by election cycle. So post the Trump administration, we've seen a pretty marked increase in conservative social movements targeting firms, which is interesting in and of itself. We then have to code stakeholder ideology. And at this point, and this is different from the draft I sent in, but at this point, we've coded 2 different core stakeholders ideology. First, we have employee ideology using aggregate FEC contributions of employees on a scale of -1 to 1, again, purely conservative to purely liberal. And then we also capture headquarters state government ideology using Coffey and Warshaw's really incredible AJPS data that they've made public that codes local government ideology based on hundreds of actual, the policy orientation of actual bills. So one interesting thing is that these are not extremely highly correlated as you might think they would be. So the correlation coefficient between local government ideology and employee ideology is just 0.4. So our independent variable is going to be an interaction, an alignment variable that captures whether the boycott and the stakeholders are aligned. So we're going to be interacting boycott ideology and employee ideology, and boycott ideology and headquarters state government ideology. And then we're testing for disruption with 2 different independent variables, one that's within the firm's control and one that isn't. So abnormal returns on the day of the boycott announcement capture the market's response to the boycott, which we think is a kind of rough proxy for how the market perceives general stakeholders to be responding to the boycott. And then the other dependent variable is concession, which is just a 0 if the firm never does anything positive in response to the boycott, and 1 if it ever takes any public position that is a concession to the boycott. So just to run really quick through the results, I just thought I'd show you kind of the main results since we have such little time. We do not find a significant finding on the interaction of boycott ideology and headquarter state government ideology when we look at market returns, but we do find a significant effect of alignment with employees. So this graph is showing you how that interaction pans out. What is really interesting about it is the action seems to be primarily driven by the conservative boycott. So after conservative boycotts, we see a statistically significantly different market reaction if the firm has conservative employees versus liberal employees. And what I think is most interesting about this finding is that the predicted market response is significantly positive for firms with liberal employees. So they actually benefit from being targeted by conservative activism. Moving on to concession, we get really strong results for concession. So stakeholder ideology alignment seems to be extremely important in driving how firms respond to boycotts. So we're seeing a significant effect here at either end of the political spectrum for social movements. Firms with conservative employees are more likely to concede to conservative boycotts than firms with liberal employees and vice versa. And we also see that strong effect for headquarters state ideology. So firms that are in states with conservative governments are more likely to concede to conservative boycotts than firms in states with liberal governments and vice versa. So the key takeaways of this project are that the ideological orientation of challenges matters. I think as a social movement scholar, most of us are studying progressive movements. And progressive movements tend to come to mind when you think about social movements. But conservative movements are out there, they're increasing, and they seem to play an equally important role in shaping corporate behavior. We find that movements are more disruptive and more likely to compel a concession when they're ideologically aligned with the core stakeholders of their target. And what the finding I think is most interesting is that social movements that are misaligned with the core stakeholders of their target may actually inadvertently benefit their targets. So they have this really interesting unintended consequence where they might actually strengthen support of the target's stakeholders. And I found this really important in talking about these kinds of patterns to executives, for example, who are worried about taking a political stance because they're worried that it's going to anger some of their stakeholders. I think what our results say is that so long as you're being authentic and your employees and your core stakeholders know what you believe and support it, then you can be brave about taking a position, because even if you're going to be attacked, your core stakeholders will redouble their support for you. A couple limitations. We have obviously this really coarse coding of the ideology of activist challenges and stakeholder ideology that doesn't consider the effect of issue salience. And as always in fieldwork, there are some endogeneity concerns, and it's difficult to know exactly what the mechanism is driving this. So in terms of next steps, we'd love to tease out mechanisms in this paper or a follow-up paper, because this could be driven by perceived CSR, perceived authenticity of CSR, the levels of identification. We need to parse out CEO and board ideology from general employee ideology, and we need to consider the effect of heterogeneity in between stakeholder ideology. So what happens when you're in a state with a conservative government, but most of your employees are liberal, for example. So that is all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So I'm presenting obviously with Ren, And we're going to be talking about the shutoffs in Detroit. But since this is a social movement session, I'm actually going to start with a couple examples of social movements. So what you see in these pictures are social movements that have been going on over the past decade, some of them even more recently than that. Pictured here, there is a protest about the privatization of the prison system. There are people that are marching because of the rising costs of housing in the US. You also see pictured contestation over increases in pharmaceutical drug prices. And then you also see in the bottom left corner some healthcare workers, mostly nurses, who are protesting what's going on currently in the pandemic, but also making calls for healthcare for all. So when we look at these different movements and protests happening, what do they all have in common? So one of the things that we see is that they really demonstrate this rising increase in discontent with the spread of market ideologies and market systems, especially into areas that have traditionally been either the domain of public services or in goods and services that are considered to be essential to human rights. What we also see happening across these different movements is the current era. So between the pandemic and then a reemergence of or resurgence of movements like Black Lives Matters and the movement for Black lives around racial inequities, we see the intersecting injustices that can take place when you have an unchecked spread of these market ideologies and these market systems. So when we talk about, like these market ideologies, what is this actually? So it's called marketization. And so technically speaking, marketization is this process by which we start to see, like market logics and the policies that support markets, they start infiltrating our non-market arenas, and they eventually can displace non-market activities. So we see this already happening in all types of organizations such as churches, nonprofits, in the state. In fact, we see it in universities, and there's a growing literature on the marketization of business schools. So in all these different types of organizations, we see them adopting these techniques, practices, logics, and discourse that we normally associate with market environments. So if we look then, going back to these social movements and look to see what the movements and markets literature more generally says about this, how social movements are interacting and contesting markets. One way to look at it is to break it into sort of three different buckets. So first we have movements that have kind of embraced the market system as a tool that they can also use and benefit from. So there's a growing literature that's looking at how social movements actually create new markets and facilitate the development of these new industries that don't have some of the same problems that the ones they contest do. There's also research on social movements that target the ills that can come from these marketizations. So looking at the social injustices, environmental injustices that come from marketized systems and trying to alleviate them. And then finally, it's a smaller area of research, but growing, there is research on social movements that actually try to eliminate some of these products and services altogether. And so while they do go after the markets, they're doing it as a way to make sure those products don't exist. So going back to our four examples of those social movements from the beginning, what they're really doing is different. They're not trying to eliminate those products or services. And they're not just trying to alleviate some of the injustices. They're actually targeting the very market ideas of it itself. So we consider this to be demarketization. So this process by which the market systems and ideologies are unwoven from the fabric of society. And social movements that engage in demarketization are actually doing that work of deconstructing the market structures that are there with the goal of reconstructing a new system where those goods and services are provisioned in a way that's more socially, environmentally just. And that's where we actually end up seeing a lot of social innovation taking place. So that brings us to our research question. So how do these demarketization movements form? And then how do they engage in this process of demarketization? So how does it unfold? We look at this in the context of Detroit and their water system.
Great, thanks, Jocelyn. So some of you have seen some research that's just published with Tina Dason, actually, who's on the call. Hi, Tina. Using the earlier part of this data, but this is really an extensive longitudinal qualitative study, lots of interviews, media, sort of insider minutes of meetings of the Detroit Water Department, et cetera, and a lot of the local NGOs and groups, which continued from about 2013 through to the present day. So we're still collecting data on this and trying to capture what's happening around COVID and the water shutoffs in Detroit. So I won't go through this in detail, but I'm happy to answer questions about it. And so why Detroit? Obviously, vast majority Black population, 82%, 40% of the population living under the poverty line. And the water department had been, a long-standing institution, supplying public water services for well over a century, but had been struggling with many of the financial problems that Detroit and many industrialized cities, obviously in the Rust Belt and other parts of the US, have struggled with. So we entered the field. This is a chart, I know it's not great quality, from the Detroit Water Board. We entered the field in the fall of 2013. And again, we talked to a bunch of stakeholders, different people who knew what was going on, who thought Detroit might be privatized. So this is one of the reasons that Detroit was so interesting. But while I was there in the field, they also started to shut the water off. So this was unexpected. The two were related. People thought that they were shutting the water off to clean up the books for the privatization. So you can see they were doing a very normal level of water shutoffs. Everybody does that. And it peaked to 72 households a month. So this is households, not individuals, in the summer of 2014, spring and summer of 2014. So what I'm going to do here is walk you through our theoretical model, put a bit of the data along with it, but there's a lot to unpack here, so I'll go fairly quickly. This is all fresh off the press, so we're would love some comments, etc. So we have a 4-stage model here that I'll go through. And what we're really trying to do at the top is trace out how the movement developed. So we start when there really wasn't a local movement around water justice, how that developed. And then at the bottom, we're trying to trace out the sort of market logics or how people thought about the market. And what you'll see with the two triangles is we see the two being sort of, inversely correlated. So this first stage, we're calling public service as private commodity. And here in terms of the movement, there really is not much going on at all. This is a very individualized problem. If your water is shut off, there's a lot of stigma around this, a lot of blame. You can see in the quote on the side. And so it's seen as a very individual problem. And so in terms of the market, the reason that is, or part of the reason that is it's very market dominant. So water is seen as a commodity. It's very much, taken for granted. If you can pay for it, you get it. If you can't pay for it, you don't get it. So what changed? How did we sort of move on from this stage? Several things happened. So again, it's highly stigmatized. So people are really not talking about the fact that their water is being shut off. They're very embarrassed of it. There's a lot of fear. The water department outsources the shutoffs, and the shutoff contractors decide they're going to go around and spray a little stripe of blue spray paint on the sidewalks after they've shut somebody's water off. So people come out of their houses in the morning and realize, hey, they're not alone. Most of their neighbors have also had their water shut off. So there was a lot of sort of revealing of what was going on. A prominent local activist was arrested, arguing with the shutoff contractors. And also Maud Barlow, global water justice activist, was in town to give a talk. So a bunch of things sort of pushed this over. It became sort of out of the shadows. So we get into the second phase of our model, which we're calling public service is essential. People really start to see what happens when you're living without water. And again, there's tens of thousands of people surviving without water in Detroit in the spring and summer of 2014 and still. We start to see this community identity. So people start to realize, hey, it's not just me, but it's other people in my, on my block, my socioeconomic status, other people who look like me, etc. And along with that, we start to see a bit of market adjustment. So people saying, hey, maybe this isn't quite right. Like maybe we need to do something, repayment plans, et cetera, just to tweak this a little bit so that people can survive, basically. So how do we move on from this stage? Oops, got something weird popping up. decided not to work. Okay. So the UN comes back. Maud Barlow had been in town. Detroit had made a complaint, a formal complaint under the human right to water to the UN. The UN comes back. A lot of media outlets say there's no way the UN's replying to Detroit. Clearly they're focused on what's happening in Africa, etc. But the UN comes back within a week and says, indeed, this is a violation of the US's obligations under the UN human right to water and sanitation. So there's huge protests. You might recognize Mark Ruffalo there. I won't read out the sign above his head, but you can figure out what it means. Okay, so we move on to this third phase here, which we're calling intersectional identity. So that's huge amount of media attention. It explodes around the world. Local media in Detroit had not been covering this. There's a whole history of sort of race-based issues and stuff like that. But we start to see global media covering this and a lot of other groups that weren't really aware of it. Environmental groups, et cetera, who've been working on fracking, et cetera, start to allies start to get on board with this. And so we're calling this public services moral right based on the UN's response saying there's a human right to water. And what starts to happen with the market, like once we start to think of water as a human right, is people start to say, hey, we really need to adjust the way that the market's working. Like maybe we need subsidization of people in the lowest income brackets, et cetera. Like it's not working. So we need to look at this. So what happens then? There's a lot of talk around this. It's really very active, but it seems to sort of puddle along for a few years. But you start to see things which, as some of you are probably aware of, the Flint water crisis. So about an hour from Detroit, poor Michigan's not doing very well on water, but breaks out. So the lead poisoning, obviously children with high levels of lead, and also Standing Rock. So the quote on the left, talking about, Native people being voiceless. And so we start to see this, talking about water, a lot more awareness of water spreading. And of course, then what really triggers this, moving into our final stage, is COVID breaks out. So this is, not academic research, but something out of Business Insider and some of the local groups really overlaying the relationship between the shutoffs and COVID outbreaks. And of course, you can imagine it's hard to wash your hands if you do not have running water in your home. So we really start to see the societal identity is what we're calling it, and the final people realizing that even if they don't care about justice or race issues, that if the poorest people in society don't have running water, it's going to impact all of us and it's going to spread. And then we start to see really these huge market challenges, people questioning, should the market really be supplying a basic service such as water? And that's what Jocelyn started with, and I will turn it back to her.
Great, thanks. So this work we view as making two kind of major contributions to literature. One is obviously in the social movements and markets literature. And through our really unique data, we're just really fortuitous that Ren happened to be at the right place at the right time studying privatization when all of this broke out. So we actually have the opportunity to see the actual formation process of a movement, which we don't often get a chance to study in the movements and market space. We also demonstrate that there are additional structural and social barriers being faced by vulnerable populations when it comes to mobilizing against market actors. And we show that these vulnerable populations play a really important role in constructing barriers and differentiation between the market and the non-market domain. The other area that we contribute to is this research on marketization and commodification. So we do build out the model of the demarketization process. And the other thing that we're able to show is the changing relationship between these public services and the people that are involved. So we see this transition from both sides viewing them as customers back to being citizens again, which have different rights. So that brings us to the end of our time, and I want to thank you so much. We are really looking forward to your feedback, especially as Ren mentioned, this is very brand new. Thanks.
So we changed a little bit the title. We had worked a little bit on this research since we sent the submission, but this is my dissertation research, and we have been working on transforming this from a monograph to a paper. This is the first time we kind of present this, so any feedback or comments are super welcome. This paper was developed with Mike Lansbury and Joe Gaiman that are here. Yay, thank you for you guys to coming. And now it changed the title. So now we are looking at the new title is Becoming Robust, How Social Movements Overcome the Pitfall of Institutional Complexity. And I want to kind of just give like a pretty quick introduction that we saw a lot of now social movements and contention and conflict and some type of contention in a sense, like more a protest. That's kind of a little bit different of what this paper is going to talk about, especially because of the context that we are, or the country that we're at, that it's Brazil. We look this in the theoretical framework of social movements and institutional complexity. So we know that social movements can have a major role in institutional complexities because they allow diffusion, and also they can deal with this complexity. They can be one part, like how you deal with the conflict that is going on in any context or any situation, and how you do that in a collective way. So we look at that with that social length, that institutional complexity, but also you have the social movement that is more collective, that has more mobilization versus only one organization. And we look at the solidarity economy movement in Brazil, and it specifically focus in one organization, and that organization is Caritas. So I'm going to go back a little and talk about the solidarity economy movement in Brazil. The idea of this movement is to change the market and to change the way that the market is, from one of business that you have a hierarchical stand and only some people own it, you can exploit, and it's a very Marxist view of capitalism, to a view of capitalism that would be more just and equal, and that is the idea of the creation of cooperatives. So when you create cooperatives, then you have a company that is collective owned, so everyone profit of it, and you also have participatory decision making, so everyone is deciding what you're going to do. So in Brazil, it emerged and I'm going to say coalesces around the mid 90s and beginning of 2000s. It's when the word starts to appear in newspaper or books or any kind of document, and in 2002, in the World Social Forum, they created the Brazilian Solidarity Economy Forum, which kind of, in a way, formalizes the movement. And they also entered the government in 2003. So when we have the Workers' Party entering the government in Brazil, the movement has like a role in it and becomes a secretary under the Ministry of Work and Employment. So at that point, not now anymore, but they worked a lot with the government in that sense. So, and Caritas, if you don't know, it's a Catholic organization, is an international Catholic organization. They have chapters around the world, and they have the Brazilian chapter of Caritas. And Caritas is one of the major players in the solidarity economy movement. So when Caritas changed its view in the 80s, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, they started to focus their development issues, their social issues, like how we're going to help these poor people in Brazil, looking more at empowering the community instead of just giving or donating money or food. And with that, in the World Social Forum, they were one of the main actors in the plenary that created the Solidarity Economy Forum in Brazil. So they have been like a central organization for this movement. The other three organizations that we have is universities, unions, and the Workers' Party. But Caritas is the one that is working on the ground. So they are the one that have organizations across Brazil trying to create these cooperatives and trying to expand them. So we focus on looking at them in this context. I shared a little bit of the history before, but the important part here to understand the complexity and how Caritas navigated this complexity to be successful is this history. So in the 60s, Caritas was very charitable oriented. So the idea would be I get money from European countries and I buy food and I just distribute to these poor people here in Brazil. In the 70s, they started to create like more social programs that would not only be donations, but trying to help individuals with maybe some vaccination programs or like health programs and all of that. And it's only in the 80s, due to what is going on in Brazil and in the Catholic Church with like a liberation theology, that they change their focus and they become more focused on empowering the community. So if you think about their change, they go from a more conservative kind of view of social justice and helping others to a more progressive view over time. And this progressive view culminates later on with them being one of the founders or the creator of the solidarity economy movement in Brazil. So what our paper tried to see is the impact of Caritas in social movements outcomes. And the first one, it's kind of, in a way, kind of self-explanatory, but the idea would be that having a Caritas in a community is going to increase the likelihood of these cooperatives to be created. So we have seen a lot of research showing how social movements influence foundings. Most of them focus on framing. So a social movement changed the framing of a community and they are more acceptable new ideas. So we saw that with the solar panel or wind panel. And here it's not, we focus a little bit more of the social movement organization. So we go back to the idea of the social movements that bring in resources, and we look at Caritas as an organization. And the idea here is they don't necessarily change the framing of that community, but they have a space for training, socialization in this new idea of cooperative. They create market fairs where these cooperatives can sell their products. And they also provide capital for cooperatives to create their business. So they have a rotating solidarity fund that each kind of month, one cooperative can get money. So in that sense, our idea is that Caritas, if you have a Caritas in a community, that is going to be positively related with solidarity economy enterprises foundings. But the story is not very simple, because Brazil, religion and the Catholicism has been there's many camps, there's a lot of logics, and there's a lot of complexity going on in the Catholic Church in Brazil. So we have different camps that influence how someone is Catholic. So now you know the Pope Francis, I think just 2 days ago, he said it would be fine for having same-sex unions. And he was part of a more progressive, though neutral kind of view of the Catholic Church and less conservative. In the 60s and 70s, if you don't know, Latin America suffered with dictatorship, so mainly funded by the United States to stop the progress of communist communist ideas in Brazil. And in that situation, a lot of priests took a stand and said, you know, the church is not only about individual or self-salvation or spiritual issues, it's about political and social issues. So they take a stand and they change their views, and the idea of liberation theology is created. It's very radical, it's very based on Marxist ideas. And a lot of these priests, they are part of the protests against dictatorships. They are tortured and they are murdered. And they created these organizations called ecclesial-based community. And the idea of these organizations is that they change the way the church is. So now if you think about the Catholic Church, where you have the priest and there's a hierarchical way of dealing with God, you can only talk with God if you talk with the priest, or if you go to the church, you cannot directly read the Bible. And that's the main difference if you know about Protestantism versus Catholicism. They change that. They say, no, if you're a lay person, you can celebrate a mass, you can do your own thing. We should be more inclusive and participatory. The priest is not like the most important person in the Catholic Church. The people are, you are going to decide it. So they change the way that the Catholic Church is structured. And it's a way that is way more democratic, way less hierarchical, way more empowering of people, and way more focused on the political and social issues than it is in individual spirituality or salvation. And in that point, Caritas has a very distinct situation from this view. So what we think when we think about the work of Caritas as a social movement and how would that influence it, the idea here is that these communities that has these more radical views, these more progressive views, Caritas would have a competing effect. So they're not going to be trusted by these progressive people. They're not going to be seen as someone that can help them with their goals, and they're not going to be helping these communities in creating solidarity economy enterprises. In one of the communities that I discussed, they actually said that they did have a Caritas, but they shut down the Caritas because it was not compatible with their ideological stance. They tried again, and because again, Caritas was not empowering, it was not about the people, they kind of closed Caritas again. It was only later on in 2005 that they opened a Caritas, and now the Caritas work with these groups and these priests to create solidarity economy enterprises. So in this sense, we also problematize that, okay, normally in a time frame, we do have Caritas having a competing situation with this more progressive kind of view of the church. But over time, especially after 2003 with the World Social Forum and Caritas becoming a prominent actor in this kind of very progressive event, not movement, they kind of realign again with the progressive church, and then their work with the progressive church is now positive. So they are together, one collaborating and reinforcing their actions. And the other part that we think here is like, okay, so what happens with Caritas in a very conservative community? So in a community that kind of do not agree with the liberation theology and has this very kind of conservative view of the Catholic Church, and if you know anything, would be more like the previous Pope view of the Catholic Church. So what happens with Caritas there? The idea here is that even Caritas, when they move to this more empowerment view, they become the free spaces where people in that movement can start to see this idea of cooperatives and new organizations and more collectivist view of the market. So in this situation, so when we have more conservative views, Caritas is the free space. And because Caritas is also a neutral organization, she never took a strong instance like a stake in any like this very radical liberation theology. They never suffered with like the dictatorship issue. So they were always like a very neutral, very flexible type of organization. They were always working with all kind of the actors that they could. And they also continued their work very kind of diverse and like not only focus on one thing or the other. So that would allow Caritas to actually enter these more conservative communities and be the main driver of the creation of solidarity economy enterprises. And we did, yeah, this is kind of again that, but and then the third one would be evangelical. So in Brazil now, the Catholic Church has been changing more recently with charismatic Catholic Church. So that's response to evangelicals. And in that sense, as more charismatic Catholics increase, they're a little bit more conservative, but there's also kind of this increase happens because evangelicals increase. So our idea here is that Caritas would help this because evangelicals do have the values that if you're an entrepreneur, that's good, to generate your own income, it's good. So we kind of test that in a quantitative, like a regression analysis, and the time frame is 94 to 2009. So we get a little bit the legitimation of Caritas, and we get like these changes over time that happen with evangelicals. We use a mixed effects negative binomial. We have more than 5,000 municipalities. And the variables, the dependent variable is the foundings of Solidarity Economy Enterprises. So this is a huge database created by the Secretary of Solidarity Economy in Brazil. They did in-person interviews to make sure these were actually organizations that were collective and democratic managed. Caritas is the existence of a chapter of Caritas in a given municipality. Progressive Catholic Church, so the way that we could look at that is the Northeast is progressive in general, like that's like what we know from the qualitative data. The Southeast is very conservative, and the other regions in Brazil are pretty neutral. So we created that with the percentage of Catholic and being negative for conservative and positive for progressive. If Caritas is legitimated, is a dummy variable after 2003, when they have the forum created, and evangelicals is the percentage of people who identifies as an evangelical. This is the control variables, this is the result. So Caritas is positive related, so they help the creation of solidarity economy enterprises. They are negative related with progressive Catholic Church. They become positive once there is this legitimacy, and evangelicals is not significant. This is a little bit of the moderation effect. And the general contributions is to look at social movements and institutional complexity. And I think one idea here that we have, and we're trying to think more about it, is how Caritas become kind of a robust organization that is a little bit ambiguous, that is very flexible and multivocal, and they can deal with these different situations in this complexity. So they're not hybrid, they don't pick and choose which logics they're gonna use. They actually embrace all of them and just do whatever it's easier in that sense. So they become very flexible and open-ended in their decision-making. And as we go forward, we want to show the mechanisms of how this social movement become robust. So like how Caritas, or what Caritas did specifically in these circumstances that allowed them to be robust. And that's it. Thank you. Sorry for the...
Thank you so much, Paola. Next, we're going to have Matthew Grimes to provide some summative comments across these presentations.
First off, thank you to all of the organizers for putting together this great set of presentations and authors, and keeping the community and conversation going during this time. I should note that I'm approaching this discussion largely as a fan of this literature, a fan of all the authors. So I was happy to have the pleasure of reading the work. I'll try to be quick since we're looking at around 15 minutes, and there's a number of way smarter people than me on this call, so I'm going to try to be quick so we can leave time for the questions that are showing up in the chat box. I should mention I'll try to facilitate that discussion. So if you do have questions for the authors and you haven't already put those into the chat box, go ahead and do that even while I'm chatting, and so that we can move quickly through those questions. Also, if the authors would like to respond to anything in the chat function, you can also feel free to do that as well simultaneously. So May's piece, I love papers in general that kind of problematize these longstanding assumptions, and in this case, the study of course problematizes this presumed relationship, I think, between social activism and firm performance, revealing that activism doesn't always result in declining performance. And indeed, some firms actually benefit from these attacks. And the contingency here seems to be driven by this kind of degree of ideological alignment. And I really like the exploration of this moderating effect. And when I first started thinking about this, even before reading your results, I thought, oh, well, okay, so maybe what we'll observe here is that firms are more likely to listen to those activists who are ideologically aligned. So they'll learn from the criticism and ultimately become more, robust, to use Paola's term, right, and thus benefit. But I think, the effect that you're finding is potentially even more interesting, right? So, and it brings to mind this, there's this article from The Atlantic that was in 2019 that highlighted that in American politics, that it's in fact oriented around negative partisanship. So people have actually surprisingly become less and less attached to their particular party over time, which is very counterintuitive. However, at the same time, they've become more and more hateful of the opposing party. So if the other party doesn't support something, well, then I'm definitely going to support it. And so it's an interesting effect that you're finding here. And I guess I'll just raise a couple of issues that for your consideration. So, I noticed that you did shift the framing of this paper from the paper away from kind of themes of authenticity and hypocrisy and identity. And those are all themes that I love, but I think probably those themes would have raised more issues and questions from potential reviewers, which is probably what you're recognizing as well. So I think you've made a good choice there. Another question around theory method fit. So your focus is on these kind of short event windows and abnormal returns, I think, looking at the active trading day of the boycott and the next day. I guess one of the things that your theory presupposes, I think, is that stakeholders care about and account for these ideological misalignments, and I can buy that, right? But I wondered about the degree to which the shareholders in this case are making these same day trading decisions and actually care about whether it's aligned or misaligned. And I suppose related to this, your theory is making these arguments related to almost the character of these organizations, right? Even to the extent that you've pulled out that literature around authenticity and hypocrisy, there is something about that, there's a kind of the potential for a lasting effect here. And so I'm wondering if you widen that window and do you see these more lasting effects? So just something to consider. So I'll then move on to the Montgomery and Leitzinger piece. Of course, incredibly timely paper looking at this mobilization of vulnerable communities and the empowerment of these communities from victims to activists. Obviously the data here is so rich, the setting is really compelling, and the focus here on various forms of identity really begins to show, I think, a lot of the detailed micro mechanisms around the, really institutional complexity that Paula was discussing. So I really like the idea of examining how different stages of identity development relate to different orientations toward demarketization, which is kind of what you're showing at these different stages. This seems quite novel to me if you can really unpack and show that linkage between identity development and the kind of stages of demarketization. You do seem to bound this study toward a focus on studies of social movements that impact markets, and you try to distinguish movements which merely seek concessions from market actors from those that are attempting to demarketize. I did start to wonder about whether movements that are engaged in demarketization are likely to operate in fundamentally different ways from movements more generally, particularly as it relates to issues of identity and collective identity. You seem to be presuming that it does, but I guess I wondered if it does. Is your theory really a theory of collective identity mobilization, specifically in the context of demarketization, or are you explaining, these identity mobilization patterns that might be applicable to many different types of movements? Empirically, I wondered about a couple things. First, the role of organizing. So how much does activist organizing and activist organizations matter to the findings and to the theory that you're surfacing? Right now, this seems kind of implicit in your data, but I may be reading too much into it. And the second is kind of the opposite of this, right? So part of your theory is about this shift from individual identities, these individual, the individual identity of victimhood, to empowering these kinds of social identities. But the voices of those individuals and their individual identities seem to be less present or prevalent in your data when compared with the voices of the activists and the organizers. And so, if your story really is about the identities of these within these communities and the movement of those identities across time and space, I'd be interested in seeing more of that in your data. And then finally, the Ometo, Lounsbury, and Gaiman piece. First off, I think I love this topic. The question of robustness or potentially even resilience as an outcome in the context of institutional complexity, I think is hugely important. It makes me think too of the many recent social movements which have initially kind of exploded with interest around the world, where resources and identities get mobilized towards some collective goal, But then as they grow and begin to more formally organize, they also begin to feel the weight of that institutional complexity that you're surfacing. And and in those situations, it's no longer as much about the collective identity of the movement, but instead about trying to uphold all of these multiple identities that are represented internally, but also responding to the multiple contextual values or institutions outside the movement. And so it feels in some ways like movements around the world are at times collapsing under their own weight. I don't know if I'm reading that appropriately, but it seems that some of the themes you're exploring speak to this pattern that we're observing. Also, as I put my entrepreneurship hat on, I'm also really intrigued about your outcome variable, which kind of gets sort of buried a little bit here. But I'm intrigued about the way in which these movements and various logics intersect with the regional ecosystems, entrepreneurial ecosystems. At present, it seems that when I look at your data, you are controlling for a lot of those regional factors and governance arrangements, and I started to wonder whether you considered actively theorizing around these to help you connect a little bit more closely with your particular outcome variable, which is the founding of these groups. It seems like there might be a very interesting entrepreneurship story to tell, but of course I'd say that so you don't have to take that framing. I think my only other comment on this paper is that the mechanisms that you discussed in the contributions didn't entirely come through in your presentation. So perhaps the data to illustrate those mechanisms around multivocality, are there in your data, and that would be great to see and even place into your model, because I think that could be a rich story to tell. So let's move on to some of these questions.
I've been reading a lot of May's work lately, so I've been thinking about corporate contestation and how organizations react, and also thinking about organizational opportunity structures and ideology, all the things you're raising. But watching the debate last night, I sort of wondering how exceptional this U.S. context is for theorizing movements and corporations, and whether we find these effects in other contexts cross-nationally. So it seems like it'd be useful, and we're at the stage of studying corporate contestation, that we need a bit more cross-national research to understand how this stuff generalizes.
Yeah, I'd say I think that the effects would hold, but would be almost impossible to study in the quantitative way we do across movements in a more complex political system. So in some ways, given that I like to kind of look at all movements together empirically, my research really benefits from being cited in a place where we have kind of two warring tribes at the moment, because we can kind of simplify the story. I think it would take more qualitative approaches if you wanted to go even to the UK, where there are many different tribes that are kind of grappling for voice.
Just one other thought, and we can open it up, is I'm wondering if our community's knowledge has been out there to enable these conservative movements. And so I sort of wonder about the origins of these conservative movements and how they're learning from us. We're sort of giving the tools and capabilities to these bastards.
Yeah, given that everyone I grew up with are those bastards, as a person coming from Alabama, I think people are being sincere in their pursuits of morality on either side of the political spectrum. I disagree, and I do my best to talk to them, but I don't think that they're bad people. I actually think that the conservative camp is reading our work more closely than the progressive camp in some ways. So I actually was called by the chief communications officers of Chick-fil-A a couple years ago and asked to come out and present to the board there what our research said. And I really struggled with it, and finally had to say, I just don't think I'm comfortable doing this. And I really appreciate the invitation, but yeah.
So, so Christine, you had a question for Ren and Jocelyn's piece around mobilization, about thinking more broadly around mobilization. Do you want to ask that question?
Oh, so I think that I've had so many different thoughts as we've gone through. I've been very active in my chats. So I love the mobilization paper. I thought that was really terrific work. So thank you, Ren and Jocelyn, for presenting that.
So you said perhaps we need to think about mobilization with regard to whom?
And I think it was as we were thinking about, in some sense, all three of these papers together, right? Right there, some are focused very much on corporate, some are, and in some sense, I asked that question almost too early, because you then start to talk about how it's sort of moving from a market to sort of thinking about this as sort of a public good. But in some sense, it's just a general question about whether these processes are different when we're thinking about corporate mobilization versus mobilization of different kinds of actors, like governments. It's sort of a variant of the U.S. question, I think, but not about geography, but about actors that we might be thinking about.
Right. Yes. I mean, it is very interesting to look specifically at these communities and the transformation of these communities, right, over across time, which is, I think, what you're trying to capture here, and perhaps perhaps mobilization is different in these contexts, because I think that you are trying to carve out something distinctive about this setting, and so I think that's going to be key to trying to say something not only important about that context, but theoretically as well. What is it that is distinctive about mobilizing identities in this space? Great. And then with respect to the last paper, does anybody have a final question that we can end on? I feel bad about selecting one question, given that this will be the last one. Any questions?
So I guess I'll just follow up on the multivocality question around sort of ambiguity, the ambiguity of the narrative. When is that multivocality, and when is that sort of lack of a lack of cohesion, and sort of, because in some sense, when I think about robust action, there's a strategic element, right, to thinking about using that ambiguity in a way to be attractive to different audiences. And I wonder how you can, how you think about that, essentially.
I think, at least for in the qualitative data, I try to see what they are saying and how they created this program. So you can see a little bit of their thinking and strategizing how to deal with these different people. It's very intentional of how they say and talk about it. So that's kind of how I'm looking at now. It's okay, there is a general ambiguous way that they do, or they present themselves in many different ways, but there is also behind the scenes, I made interviews with coordinators to see okay, did they had that in mind, or were that something intentional or not?
And it does raise the question about contingencies here as well for me, because I mean it's clear that there are arguments for resolving ambiguity, there are arguments for strategic ambiguity, but you might actually have the capacity to, if you have that data on multivocality, to begin to explore those contingencies where it does and doesn't lead to successful foundings.